Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to Eckstein Hall at Marquette University Law School. I'm Mike Goucher. This is On the Issues. This is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people we like to say are doing important, interesting work in this region and beyond. Today we have a fascinating discussion about just how local politics should be, and we're joined today by three experts in their own respective fields. Seated next to me is Professor Heather Gerken. She is the J. Skelly Wright Professor of Law from Yale Law School. She's also going to be delivering our Bowdoin Lecture later tonight. Some of you will be here to see that. So we welcome Professor Gerken to the law school. Seated next to Professor Gerken is Craig Gilbert. Craig is the Washington Bureau Chief for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. He's also with the law school for 6 months as a Lubar Fellow of Public Policy Research, and he's working on a series of stories, probably will be a series of stories on political polarization, particularly in this region. We are politically polarized, in case you haven't noticed. And seated next to Craig is Charles Franklin. Professor Franklin is a professor in law and public policy here at Marquette Law School. We're delighted that we could lure him over here from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And as you all know, Charles is also the director of the Marquette Law School poll. So please give them all a warm welcome to Marquette University Law School. Well, tonight, Professor Gerken is going to be talking about dark money and the future of political parties, and that sounds like a pretty interesting topic in itself. But we want to talk to her today and to Charles and Craig about a couple of other things, and primarily we're going to focus on this notion of federalism and on what's happening in terms of federal governments, state governments, local governments, and Professor Gerken has written pretty extensively on this subject. So I think I'll begin with you. That seems logical to me. And let's talk about your views on some of this. I said how local should politics be, but let me turn it around. You've written that many progressives, people who are liberal in their politics, are skeptical of federalism, and you said with good reason. And yet you're making the case for a progressive federalism. What do you mean by that? Why is that a good thing?
Well, so just for those of you who aren't familiar with the divides in the legal academy, almost all academics are pretty liberal, as you might suspect. And almost all of them are nationalists. That is, they believe in national power. They're deeply suspicious of federalism and its homely cousin, localism. And they are for basically one reason. And that is simple. They think that federalism and localism are bad for the two groups they care most about. This is particularly true in constitutional law, and that is racial minorities on the one hand and dissenters on the other. And so they have a view that the way to think about race and dissent in this country is to focus on rights and national power and national protections, and it's with good reason, right? I mean, dissenters and African Americans in particular, but Latinos as well, have had a pretty tough time with federalism in past years. And so that's the way the story goes. And whenever you have a debate about federal versus national power, the nationalists will always say at some point, well, what about Jim Crow? And the federalism folks will offer kind of an apologetic sidebar, and that's about how the discussion goes. It's about as illuminating as that old beer ad, tastes great, less filling, right? That's as far as we've gotten. So my work is devoted to convincing the progressives and the nationalists that this is not your father's federalism anymore. And that whatever you might have thought about the days of Jim Crow and the way that state sovereignty was used to justify and protect discriminatory practices, it's no longer true now. And in fact, if law professors would actually pay attention to what's happening on the ground, they'd realize that actually a lot of interesting things are happening for racial minorities and dissenters on the ground at the state and local level. And that's for kind of an obvious reason, math. So just if you do the math and you think about what is it that the nationalists want, they want a system where everyone gets to have a share of the voting power at the top, right? That's a national system, perfectly sensible democratic idea. But if you think about it, for racial minorities and dissenters, the two groups that they care the most about, a national vote on anything is a guarantee that they're going to lose every time they talk about issues that matter to them, on the issues in which racial minorities and the majority divide, on issues that dissenters and the majority divide. Whereas federalism is the one place where we not only tolerate but glory in the idea that national minorities constitute local majorities. And so we see forms of that really important power playing out for dissenters and racial minorities all across the country. They are able to do things at the state and local level they cannot do at the national level, which is to exercise the power of the majority, to stand in the shoes of the majority. And I think that's important in a democratic system. I call it turning the tables, taking turns, right? Having the usual losers win and the usual winners lose. And that's what federalism does for these groups. And I think that's what the nationalists forget is true about what is our federalism now, but not our father's federalism.
And you're advocating taking federalism all the way to the ground, I think, is your language. What do you mean? Down to as local units of government as possible?
So this, I mean something just a little bit different than that. But what I mean by it is that this is where I attack everybody in the academy. That's your job when you're an academic, is to disagree with everyone. So on the one hand,
Charles, did you hear that?
Right, sorry.
But I disagree.
The nationalists are sort of myopic in their focus on national powers, if that's all that matters. But the funny thing about federalism scholars is they pretty much only think about states. So states, that's all they worry about. And states are perfectly useful units to worry about. But if you think about the values of federalism, all the reasons that we care about state power, that it fosters experimentation, that it gives people choice, that it offers dissenters and local majorities to check the center, all of the things that matter for federalism are just as true of cities and school boards and juries and so on. So we see exactly the same phenomenon playing out at the local level. I imagine those of you in Milwaukee might have some thoughts about state local tussles right now. And so there's no reason, if you care about the values associated with federalism, not to think about it all the way down and to focus on the lots of other institutions where people who are in the minority at the top are in the majority at the bottom, and think of that as a form of power.
Craig and Charles, let me bring you into this conversation. I mean, we're seeing a lot of examples, I guess, of this new progressive federalism. I mean, if you talk about some of the things that states are doing, whether it comes to marijuana laws or legalizing gay marriage, all of that is really sort of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, when we think about some of the political landscape that we live in today, I mean, this discussion gets really interesting. I mean, you've got kind of both parties exercising a check on the other party in Washington, which I think gives the parties who control governments at the state level a reason to want to exercise their sovereignty, in some cases dissent from federal policy, because nobody's agenda is getting very far in Washington. And you've also got this kind of geographic sorting going on where some red states are getting redder and some blue states are getting bluer, and the parties are so polarized from each other that even when one party gains complete control in a purple state, they veer off in a very activist partisan policy direction. Just look at the difference between Wisconsin and Minnesota. I mean, two states that are very similar politically, but are just pursuing diametrically opposed policies on the same sets of issues. And then also what happens under those circumstances, often as we see in Wisconsin, where you have one party asserting its power at the state level, is sometimes you find you have clashes with local governments, right? And as we see between the state of Wisconsin and the city of Milwaukee, where even a party that advocates localism in principle is in some cases overriding local policies for what may be good or not reasons. We can argue that, but all these things are going on, I think, in ways that make this a really rich discussion to have.
Charles?
I think it's a great moment to think about this on the side of medical marijuana or gay marriage, where you might think liberals would be pretty happy, though perhaps ironically libertarians might be particularly happy about those as well. You also have, I think, the granddaddy of them all right now, the Affordable Care Act, where we've seen so many states active in opposition to the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, or handing that, ironically, back to the federal government to implement, while others have embraced it and moved ahead with it. So the consequences of this, I think, are apparent in front of us right now. And they point in not one consistent ideological direction. Sometimes the local majority is a progressive majority. Sometimes it's a conservative majority. And this is perhaps a feature rather than a bug. The whole point would be if local control reflects local attitudes, then you get a variety of different outcomes. The one point that Craig just touched on, though, that I think is interesting as well, is that this doesn't mean consistency in the states when we are so often close to a tipping point between party control. And the parties are so divided that a shift from a Democratic to a Republican administration or the other way around at the state level can lead to sharply different outcomes in the policies pursued there, even if the public opinion hasn't shifted that much within the state. So it's an interesting issue of control by those local minorities or majorities of public opinion in the direction that the state takes.
Let me follow up on this part of the discussion. In terms of political voice, it seems like a very healthy thing that people who perhaps have not had as much say in their affairs now have a greater say. But is something lost when we look at the notion of local versus more of a national approach? Is something lost here in terms of a common good where we all agree that this is a direction we need to be moving in? Is there no longer a common good, or is it up to all states or all units of government to decide for themselves what is the good?
So this is where I am the nationalist who believes in federalism, and this is where one of my dear friends who writes a lot about federalism once sent me an email saying, "Dear Heather, I was wondering if you're writing something new." And I said, "Well, yes, in fact, I am. How do you know?" He says, "I just broke out in hives." So for the traditional federalism people, what I'm about to say, you should just start checking your skin. So I think that there's nothing inconsistent with the idea of having variation on the ground and a national goal, because I think that the variation on the ground is what forms the national consensus. So we have this kind of idea, sort of an abstract idea, that you just need to speak. The First Amendment will guarantee your right to speak, and that's all we need for a good national debate. I just think that's nonsense, and I'll just ask you for a minute. Think about the iconic image of a First Amendment speaker. It's someone out in a park standing on a soapbox, and I just want to ask you, when you see someone out in a park standing on a soapbox, what do? You walk on by. That is, you exercise the power that the majority always exercises, which is to give radio silence to those on the outside. But here's what's magic about giving dissenters control at the local level. They can force the majority, often the lazy majority or the majority filled with elites who don't want to engage, they can force them to engage with them and put things on the national agenda, tee them up for a robust national debate. So same-sex marriage is a great example. Medical marijuana is a great example. Immigration is a great example on the right. So, no one is doing things. A lot of people at the ground level, a lot of American people care about immigration and same-sex marriage and medical marijuana. But federal officials don't want to touch this. And why don't they want to touch it? Because people care about it. They don't want to get in the fight. So they will just keep, renaming post offices and doing sort of neutral things that make everybody happy. But they won't engage in the stuff that where there's a real fight. Locals are the ones who force them to. Because what they do is they don't just sit and speak or write an editorial or have a march that's pretty easy to ignore. They put in place a policy. And once that policy is in place, the national elites have to decide, are they going to leave it alone or are they going to engage and try to overturn it? And that's what tees up these debates. And over time, I think that's how we achieve consensus. That's how we figure out what our national norms are, is through these kind of robust debates that come up through the local and state level.
So even though it's a little messy, a little chaotic, it's still a good thing.
Tocqueville has always admired the messy, chaotic nature of American government. I love it. It drives law professors crazy. They like clean, neat jurisdictional lines and everything in categories. But for those of you who would like politics, that's how politics work.
Does it work in terms of setting policy?
Well, it's been argued that one of the virtues of this is that people have the right to, I think, vote with their feet, right? And so if you've got states and localities pursuing dramatically different policies when it comes to things like same-sex marriage and maybe guns within the limits of the Supreme Court decisions, or union labor law, marijuana, you name it, then, if you like what they're doing in Boulder, Colorado, you can go there. And if you like what they're doing in Phoenix, Arizona, you can go there. And that is true. At the other hand, it does sort of raise these concerns that you were raising about this sort of seeming balkanization that invites, where you've got people gravitating, if they are, toward very like-minded communities of people dominated by one side or the other, and then what does it mean for the minorities within those communities?
I just think that one of the issues which you touched on is that question of national rights, the things that the 14th Amendment guarantees, the points at which we want to insist on a national standard, versus the ability of states on other issues to experiment, to be different. And it seems to me the tension here is how do we decide what's the national consensus or the constitutional consensus, even if locales don't agree on that. And it seems to me that you're exactly right about that being the inherent tension in the nature of federalism in the society. But it also poses this dilemma about when is it fine for a local majority to rule in one direction or another versus when do we insist that there are some universal standards and how do we implement them and insist on them.
Although I do think the fight over what are acceptable exceptions is in some ways about forming the national consensus. So, there's a beautiful political theorist who says that liberalism is about working out the series of exceptions from the rules that govern the community, and that's as much about what liberalism is as the rules themselves. So I feel like that's also part of the process.
Point.
I want to come back to a point you made earlier, and let's talk a little bit about Wisconsin. I don't want to put you in an unfair position, but you probably have some familiarity with Wisconsin politics.
Everyone in the country has some familiarity with Wisconsin politics.
You have an interesting situation here. The governor has been, Charles mentioned the example of the Affordable Care Act, but our governor has said, I'm not going to expand Medicaid. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to come up with my own way of doing it. So that's an example of him kind of saying, we think we're our own laboratory. We're going to do things our way. But then you also have state government here dictating to, for example, the city of Milwaukee on residency. Is there a line that you cross where all of a sudden perhaps you're not doing things in a way that would be, consistent with a political philosophy? I mean, if you're going to be about local control, then aren't you about local control?
Yeah, I mean, politicians being consistent is not really, I also do election law, so this is not what we discovered to be true. And I'm actually fine with that. That is, I don't actually believe there's anything that is essentially local or essentially national. I actually do think that the way we work these things out over time is that we essentially allow the center occasionally to deliver what George Bush described as a good thumping to the local. So this is where we're not in your father's federalism. In the world of old federalism, there's this thing called sovereignty, right, that would protect you from intrusion of the national government. I just don't think that exists anymore. I think that mostly the national government and often the states have the formal power one way or the other to enforce their mandates when they think there's a national consensus. And it's that sort of robust fight that goes on with people taking completely inconsistent positions. I mean, all liberals were in favor of federalism when George Bush was in office. I'm the only one left now that Obama's in an office who still thinks it's a good idea. But I do think that that's sort of a natural part of the process going forward. So yes, it is totally hypocritical and absolutely inconsistent. But that's how politics work.
Sure.
How could one disagree with that? Let me take a slightly different tweak on it then, and that is sort of who controls that decision. So in some of your writing, you've talked about how the states as implementers of federal policy actually can engage in a dialogue with the feds. Even if they're implementing the policy, they're not resisting it or rejecting it entirely. So that conversation back and forth is an essential part of the laboratory of democracy or the role of the states. And it's a nice way of seeing how servants have some authority vis-a-vis the central government as well. I want to think just a little bit about the role that people play in this in terms of choosing among candidates and parties for control of their government. And that reflects the public opinion differences from place to place, whether it's city to city or state to state. And that's one way in which a critical way in which we end up with different governments across the areas. But the other side is the extent to which it's the political elites that are driving those policy decisions rather than reflecting the sober consideration of the public. And again, to come back to the Affordable Care Act as a good example of that, the one thing that the public has been very clear about since the Affordable Care Act was first enacted is that the public doesn't like it. From the time of passage, we've seen about 52 or 3% saying they have an unfavorable view of the Affordable Care Act, typically something in the low 40s with a favorable view. There's a side debate about whether those who are unfavorable didn't think it was liberal or progressive enough, so there's a side issue there. But the point is the consensus of a stable majority that we don't like this act has been there. Yet, when the Kaiser Family Foundation, which has done some of the best polling on this, asked people about the details of the act, detail after detail after detail has large majorities in favor, with the exception of the individual mandate and maybe occasionally one other thing. So this raises the question about what's the basis for the opposition between knowledge and understanding of it versus elite leadership, which has opposed it for other reasons, or at least political reasons. And that also underlies this division between the states or locales, partly driven by public opinion, but partly, and I think significantly, driven by elites and how elites choose to divide over issues and to contest them.
Laboratories of democracy, that's sometimes the way we refer to states, but I know you've been looking at that as an issue. Is that an accurate assessment of where we are? Are states the laboratories of democracy?
So now I'm getting a preview for a paper I'm right in the middle of writing. It's called The Myth of the Laboratories of Democracy. You might notice a somewhat contrarian streak here. I really actually do write occasionally affirmative projects. But so we have the laboratories of democracy is one of the very few ideas in favor of decentralization that both the right and the left, the nationalists and the federalism people accept, right? It seems like a lovely, sunny, happy idea, the kind of things you sing around a campfire, right? We should leave the states lots of room to innovate because they're either going to tailor their policies to local preferences or they're going to experiment and we can all benefit from the experiment. And it turns out to be mostly a campfire story because we think there are 50 laboratories of democracy, and there aren't. There are two. There is a red lab, and there is a blue lab. And this goes exactly to your point about elites. So what you find about the way that policies move through the country, the ones that are in politically salient questions, is that they're moving through elite networks of interest groups and parties who are running their policies, getting them in place wherever they can, and then reproduce them as quickly as possible. So when you look at the patterns of policy diffusion, they look nothing like the 50 lab model, which is one state comes up with a great idea, and people listen and wait and see if it works, and then over time they implement it themselves. No, what you see is a bunch of red states will quickly, almost immediately, put in the same policy before the experiment has run, and a bunch of blue states will do the same. And they're doing something obvious. They're teeing it up for national debate. They're trying to offer a concrete example of how something works so that it can be used as a national example once the big fat debate at the top happens. But so they're not 50 labs, there are two. And in some ways, a lot of the work that I do is about thinking about how to manage the competition between those labs and the federal government rather than to think we're just going to let every flower bloom.
As a journalist, go ahead.
Yeah, one point I would add to that, and I don't know if Heather would agree with this or not, I think what she just said is truer today than it used to be. For a couple of reasons. One, because of the way this kind of elite networks work in terms of public policy, disseminating public policy, and also just the way the parties have been nationalized. I mean, there used to be pretty striking differences between, for example, a Wisconsin Republican and a Georgia Republican, or a Massachusetts Democrat and an Arizona Democrat. And most of those kinds of geographic differences within the parties have vanished or are really minimal compared to what they used to be, so that you're not going to get all the variation within the parties in different parts of the country than you might have when you had more ideological diversity within the parties.
So are local elections now essentially national elections? Is that the point we're at?
So there's a great paper by a professor named David Schleicher, which shows something really interesting, which is it turns out if you look at local and state elections, they almost exactly mirror people's political preferences. So New Haven, Connecticut is a very Democratic city, and how the Democrats do basically mirrors how Obama does in elections. And the reason is sort of obvious when you just think about it. People use shorthand when they figure out which party they want to. They know what Democrat means and they know what Republican means, and they use those shorthand all the way down at the state level and the local level. The trouble is that mostly their opinion of whether Democrats are a good idea or a bad idea comes from national politics, not local politics. This leads some political scientists to say there's no political way to pick up the garbage. There's not like they act as if we couldn't have divides in local policy. We clearly have divides in local policy. It's easy to imagine them dividing people along party lines, but it's just that the party shorthand is so powerful that there's not a lot of space for voters to do it. The only place you see voters departing from that pattern is places like New York City. Because New York City is such a big media market, you can rebrand what it means to be a Republican. So you can have a Giuliani Republican or a Bloomberg whatever he is. You can create a different identity for the party, but only in really big places. Otherwise, the local votes tend to mirror the national votes.
We did an awful lot of polling in 2012 in the state on a variety of races.
The mad genius pollers. It was amazing how accurate they were.
Thank you very much. Yes, I know Charles appreciates that.
I'll have your check ready after this. Yeah.
That would have been nice to hear in the middle of it all, wouldn't it? What a
Never
fine
gonna
job
happen.
you're doing,
Never
Charles.
going to happen.
But I mean, let's take a look at 2012 in Wisconsin. Did we see that trend here?
I think what's striking is how, at the individual level, people have become more polarized, or if you will, put it the other way, more consistent in their partisan behavior. If you go back into the 60s at least, you can find research that points to the inconsistency of vote choices, which on the positive side is I vote for the candidate, not the party, I split ticket, vote, and so on, but which has with it the inconsistency of preferring a liberal agenda here and a conservative agenda here. What's happened over the last 2 or 3 decades is some increasing consistency so that Democrats now favor a fairly predictable list of policies, Republicans a fairly predictable and opposite list of policies. And so there's less overlap than maybe there was a few decades ago. The question is, what are the implications of that? If it is blindly following your party, then that doesn't sound very appetizing. I think the question is, when it comes time to reelect someone, whether it's the mayor or whether it's the governor or whether it's the president, how much of a role is played by whether the garbage did get picked up and picked up on time versus how much of it is the color of their campaign banner? And that, I think, brings us to the question of accountability in these things. If voters are only going to evaluate candidates on partisan and ideological terms, then they'll presumably almost never be unhappy with their guy. And that reduces accountability in an important way. On the other hand, have we in fact reached that point? I think if you look at the gigantic swings in elections between 2004 and 6 and 8 and again in 10, and here between June and November of 2012, I think maybe you'd be a little more sanguine that, in fact, there are still individual judgments being made that can tilt an election one way or another. What we found, of course, is the state is pretty divided with a pretty strong 40 or so % base for each of the parties, 40, 45, and somewhere between 10 and maybe as much as 15 or 20% that can plausibly be thought of as genuine swing voters.
Yeah, I agree. I think obviously in a purple state, if a state is competitive enough, it doesn't take a large fraction of swing voters to create those kinds of swings. But my sense in covering politics since the 1980s is that events don't matter as much as they do, as much as they did 20 or 30 years ago. Events in a campaign, things that might have been turning points, whether it's something that comes out of the campaign or something that a real news event, something somebody says, that because people are so entrenched, public opinion, those shifts just doesn't move around as much as it used to. In talking about this sort of the uniformity of the way people vote up and down the ticket, I mean, it's it used to be more commonplace that a state would vote one way for governor and one way for president. Obviously, Wisconsin is still an example of that, an interesting example of that. But I went back not too long ago and looked at that phenomenon, and the number of states that voted the same way for president in 2012 as they had in the previous race for governor was at a high, a 40 or 50-year high in this last election. So it does seem like when you look at the map of governors and the map of Senate races and the map of presidential races, those maps are kind of converging in ways that are consistent with the point you were making. What the implications are for the broader discussion about kind of localism, I'm not sure.
I'm going to take questions from the audience here in just a couple of minutes. I do want to spend, and this is sort of moving away to some degree from our discussion here, but I do, since we have Heather with us today, I do want to ask you about something that you've talked a lot about in the last 5 or 6 years, and this is this notion of a democracy index, and this deals with elections. And if you could explain to people in this room what you've advocated and exactly where this idea is right now, I think that'd be helpful.
Sure. So I proposed a few years ago creating a democracy index, which would rank states and localities ideally based on how well they run their elections. So this isn't some divisive issue like campaign finance. This is very simple. How many people stood in line? How many ballots got discarded? The things that virtually everyone can agree on. And I put the idea into a little editorial. It got picked up by then Senator Clinton and then Senator Obama in separate legislation. I thought this was great. I'm going to have this bill passed. And then without any thought to how it affected my research agenda, the two of them began to run against each other for the presidency. And there went the legislation. But I was very fortunate. The Pew Center in the States, which is very interested in data-driven management and state policy, picked up the idea and made it happen. So there is now the first democracy index. They call it the Election Performance Index, and they've let me sort of be along for the ride as it got built. But the reason why it matters is this. I was in the boiler room in 2008 and 2012 for the Obama campaign. That means I was one of the 5 or 6 lawyers watching all the problems wash over the election system from campaign operations in Chicago. And what you realize when you are on the inside is that the problems we saw in Florida in 2000, the problems we saw in Ohio in 2004 occur all the time in jurisdictions across the country. And the difference is between those 2 examples and the rest is that we just don't see them because the election is usually not close. When elections are won by large margins, reporters don't report on them, political scientists don't study them, and so the problems, which are there all the time, are just invisible to us. So my favorite moment was when Jennifer Brunner, who was Secretary of State of Ohio in 2008, said that there were no problems in Ohio this year, patting yourself on the back, because the cameras turned off at 8 o'clock. Well, the cameras turned off at 8 o'clock because there was a president at 8 o'clock. So what we are trying to do nowadays in evaluating the health of our election system is we look only where the crisis occurs, but the crisis occurs where there's a close election. So we're trying to measure annual rainfall, and we're looking where lightning strikes. So the Democracy Index is a measure of annual rainfall, and interestingly enough, it's actually given us an incredibly interesting read already on how the election system is working. I'll just say Minnesota and Wisconsin. You guys are doing just fine, not a surprise, but there's a tremendous amount of variation. So my state of Connecticut, it's a rich state, right? It ought to be running its election system very well. It's way down at the bottom with some of the southern states. You see states in the deep south, which are often on these kinds of rankings clustered at the bottom for lack of resources. They're actually up and down along the way, which suggests a couple things. One is it's not just money or political culture that matters, that there may be management tools that we can use to make our election system better. But over time, the hope is that now that we have the diagnostic tools available to figure out what's wrong with the election system, we can actually figure out how to make it better, and that's the hope behind it.
And you're pretty optimistic that this will lead to changes for the better?
Well, so in a world where everything is now highly debated in politicized terms, it's actually harder to get even election reform done. Election reform is always hard to get done because, let's face it, the foxes are guarding the hen house. You know, you see every politician wants only one thing from the next election was exactly the same electorate to show up under exactly the same circumstances. So it's hard to get election reform through generally, especially when things like voter ID have become these highly contentious issues. But I will say, things that we're discovering, just things like how much it costs to run an election. That's the kind of thing that unites the parties. Things like there are just these sort of problems that you might not notice about certain kinds of voters with disability. The South turns out to have a high obesity rate, and that seems to correlate in some places with a high rate of voters not being able to make it to the polling place. So there's all kinds of really interesting, just pure management questions which could be fixed in a sane political world, maybe even an insane one, that I think we're going to see this index helping generate solutions.
One footnote to that, when you're talking about the controversies that you don't see because the election isn't close enough. Actually, Wisconsin in 2000 and 2004 could have been a version of Florida, even though we have pretty good election administration by objective standards. The scrutiny would have been incredibly intense had, in each case, one state gone the other way, which would have meant this state, which was decided by less than half of 1 percentage point in both those elections, would have been the focal point for all that fighting because it was close enough and it would have been the tipping point at that point. And it is hard to ask an election system to be so perfect or close to perfect that it can withstand, a margin of error of a fraction of a percentage point when you're talking about a Florida and 500 votes, or even a Wisconsin and 5,000 votes.
Mm-hmm. Charles, anything you
well,
want to add
some
to
of this is the question of how accurately can you count votes. I think it was astonishing to people in Florida, but it was true here as well, because we had punch card ballots in the 2000 election here in the state, that you run the card through the counter more than once and you get a different answer each time as those hanging chads fall off and other things go on. So some people have characterized these elections as inside the margin of error, that it's never quite possible to know what some platonic true outcome was. So I think improving the technology gets you part of the way, but as we get such close elections in rare cases, we discovered just how random small things are. The bag of ballots that wasn't delivered to the central office or that was forgotten in the back room. And then those in turn become hugely controversial in a recount and other things. So I think raising the level, what you're working so hard on, and especially one of the things in your book that you point out that I think is so appropriate is just how under-resourced so many election offices are. They have so much to do. And let's face it, an election is not your everyday activity. It's the thing that happens at most a few times a year, and there's not a lot of resources being put into it.
Yeah.
Let's take some questions from the audience. You know the drill. Those of you who've been to past events, press down on the little rim, not the button, but the little rim. We'll start down here. Yeah, that's it. We'll start here, and then we'll
You have to hold it?
back up. Yeah, you have to hold it.
Okay. My concern is probably at a different level, and that has to do with the control and the danger to democracy coming as a result of the influence of, say, gerrymandering and redistricting and outside money coming in that has no interest in a particular location, or like Wisconsin, except for whatever it can get at in return as a result of that investment. So how do we begin to address or manage that, or what should we do to try to respond to that?
So there are two sort of questions. One is gerrymandering, which is it's a really fantastic subject because it's the ugliest part of politics with the pristine world of constitutional law around it. And, in terms of partisanship, it's not clear that the polarization has been caused by gerrymandering. It's clear that parties are using it egregiously to hold on to their tight majorities. But as far as the studies show, the reason why we are so polarized is because people's identities are becoming stronger and people are clustering, not so much because of the gerrymandering. On the campaign finance side, we are on the verge of the Wild West in at least half of the process, which is independent spending. That's something I'm going to talk about tonight. But for those of you who've been following the Supreme Court, there's a big case coming up called McCutcheon, where the Supreme Court is basically being asked to dismantle some of the last remains of the campaign finance system. And if we end up with a deregulated system like that, we will be back 40, 50 years in terms of campaign finance reform, and we're already seeing dramatic effects from what the court has already essentially dismantled. So the solution to that is to get some different justices up there who are going to vote differently. I mean, that is the bottom line, because what the court is doing right now is it's preventing Congress and the FEC and states from regulating. And until the court no longer does that, until the court softens up on that precedent, then there's very little that can be done besides the kind of generic disclosure and disclaimer rules.
Other questions? Yes. Just hang on a second. We'll wait for Ryan to bring you the microphone.
I have a question, I think maybe primarily for Professor Gerken. Being somebody who was calling the boiler room for many of those presidential elections you mentioned, and often seeing how it comes down to the funding and the resources and really getting election workers fed because they're there for 12 hours and there just aren't enough people really conducting the election. So I'm just wondering, from just legally, if you have any comment about the difference between, because we have a system where the election law is basically run in the states, what you think, or if you see anything on the horizon about funding or running the presidential elections differently and how that might work out.
And do you mean funding running the presidential elections in the state and localities, or the campaigns?
Right, the idea that, there's been great turnout in those last few presidential elections, really, which kind of drove almost some commentary about, well, there's a lot of fraud because there's so many people voting. When, if you're on the ground, what you see are people waiting on the south side of Milwaukee in, a precinct that is hugely overpopulated, and decisions getting made about, should we split the books? Can we split the books so we can have 4 lines instead of 2 lines? And it really does get that granular. And so for those every 4-year elections, I know there have been some who've said, well, we can make an exception because it's considered a national election, so can the law be different in terms of how it's run and how it's funded? And what do you see there, if anything?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I actually think one of the things when people talk about the cost of running elections, now that I've worked for the presidential campaign, I wish people would add how much money the political parties spend propping up the badly working election system. And that ranges from trying to make registration systems that are terrible work for the people. That means doing the job of registering voters, which really is the job of the state and the government. It means things like spotting problems. We had volunteers across the country in precinct after precinct just noticing problems that it wasn't the poll workers' fault that they didn't notice it, because they're not often very well trained. They're there for the day. They've got a million things going on. So they don't notice, for example, what our guys are noticing, which is, you're about to run out of ballots. And you're going to need to fix that problem. So there's a huge amount of resources that are devoted to that. It's just hidden from view. And it all comes down to the problem. This, I think, is a problem of local funding. So I actually don't mind at all the idea that we administer elections locally. That leads to all sorts of sort of useful things. But funding ought to come from the center and not at the local level. And the reason is just simple, that when local politicians are charged with funding decisions about elections, it's an easy call, which is not to fund them properly. Because if you're a local politician, you're competing for citizens, right? You want to fund things that people see, cops on the beat, fixing the potholes, building new schools. Nobody sees elections problems unless there's a crisis. Nobody even knows that there are election problems unless there's a crisis. And so, one of the most interesting things about being in the boiler room is 2012 was, if you might have noticed, was a tough election, and there was a lot of fights among the lawyers. There were lawsuits after lawsuits being filed across the country, mostly by the Obama campaign against Republican officials. But on the day of the election, there were a lot of suits coming out of the Obama campaign or the local Democrats that were running up against heavily Democratic precincts to get them to do what the campaign wanted them to do. But that was not because of a suspicion about partisan motive. It was because these guys were drastically under-resourced and they just couldn't take the wave of voters. So if you just look at the places where the lines were the longest, places in Philly, places in Florida, those are places that just they oftentimes don't have enough resources to move the lines through, and they don't have enough training. One of the things I really am excited about this presidential commission is that Obama has created is it's pairing election administrators with Fortune 500 CEOs. So I was just talking to a few of the commissioners, and they were saying, so the head of Disney is going to talk to us about how to run lines. Like, they know from lines, So the hope is that they'll figure out ways to leverage those resources more effectively. But I'd like to see money coming from the center.
Heather, does it concern you at all that lack of uniformity, not leaving resources aside, the lack of uniformity in election law and election administration across states when we have national elections for president, for example, and whether you're in one state or another, you may be an eligible voter in one state and not in another state. You'll be using a different voting machine. We have different rules about felons. We have different rules about age. We have different rules about registration. Everything about our system is different. It's a patchwork quilt. And does that raise any issues when you're talking about electing someone to the presidency?
Yeah, you certainly won't want to worry about lack of uniformity, particularly when voters are, the Florida problem, right? Whereas you go cast a ballot, and the odds of that ballot getting counted are far less in some places than others. So that's always an area of concern. But my bigger concern is the way that the Electoral College causes us to focus a lot on states in terms of politics. So just to explain, it's very hard to steal a national election legally. I meant legally, right? So there are many policies that you can put in place that are going to expand or contract the group of people who can vote and will affect political outcomes. Everyone knows this. But it's very hard to do that on a national scale. On a state scale, it's not that hard to steal an election at the state level legally. That is, it's not that hard to manipulate the rules in a partisan way to move one state or another to one side at one column or the other. So just like an example, Pennsylvania was debating about splitting its electoral college votes right before the presidential election. And the Republicans were very clear about why they thought it would make it harder for Obama to win the presidency. I hate to have the fate of the nation turn on one state's decisions about how to administer its election law. And so I think the problem is because we don't have a national popular vote, but we have an electoral college. And the Electoral College, Hamilton said about the Electoral College that if it was not perfect, it was nearly so. And this was not the reason that Aaron Burr shot him. So, but Hamilton was wrong. It's a giant problem in a world where politicians are controlling the levers of election administration and can use it to manipulate their political fortune.
But it's great if you're a reporter in a battleground state.
Other questions? Yes.
This election index, is that what it was called? The
Democracy Index?
Yeah,
Democracy Index, yeah. You mentioned that Wisconsin and Minnesota had a higher ranking and some states didn't. Were you able to have the factors that contributed to that? What were the criteria for measuring?
So, what goes into the measurement?
Yeah, and why would you say that these two states were ranked higher?
We're trying to, on this, there are 17 different factors that go into the measurement. Some of them are turnout and registration rates. Some are how well you deal with absentee ballots and provisional ballots. Some of them are the measures of how the machines are working.
Waiting times.
Waiting times, exactly. So there's a variety of, there are these smaller things that we hope give you a reasonable picture of how the election system is working. It's very interesting about why they are doing so well. So let's just say that everyone in election administration thinks that Wisconsin and Minnesota are pretty exceptional in the sense that it's filled with trustworthy people. And that is not true in other places. For a lot of reasons, it's had a history. A history of immense competence and a real robust tradition of nonpartisanship. And so that's been very helpful. I think also because, my view, we're guessing right now because the data literally just came out. So we're just trying to start to figure out what the drivers of performance are. We're just starting the debate about what it really is. I sort of wonder myself, since I've seen a little bit of the inside of the two states from interacting with their election administrators, is it's also such a professional group. And so this is, again, you don't want to know who runs elections in some other places in the country. It's not that they're unprofessional in the sense that they come in, they drop their pants and moon their bosses. They're just not trained in it. They're often doing 3 or 4 different jobs. They're often probate judges or the people who are there to file deeds. They have a million different things, and they don't. But there's sort of a robust tradition here of a well-run bureaucracy, and I think. And this is where you can have all the litigation you want. You can have all the civil rights you want, but a well-run bureaucracy that can fix itself as problems arise over the course of the election cycle is the best guarantor of the right to vote nowadays. Now that we've gotten rid of a lot of the bad laws, the best thing you can have is a system that is filled with professional people who can correct their own mistakes as time goes on, because you can try to knock them down from the top and have legislators yell at them. You can try to sue them. You can have outside groups lobby them. But what really matters is the ethics of the people inside. And so that's my personal guess about what the answer is. But, the political scientists, I will say, are going to start running those numbers.
It is interesting, though, even in Wisconsin, And you've just cited Wisconsin. I mean, there are people out there who do not feel all that warm and fuzzy about the way elections are run in the state of Wisconsin.
Because you are spoiled.
Well, also we have this.
Worse other places.
Does the really kind of freakish decentralization of election administration in Wisconsin have an effect, positive or negative? I think we have something like a quarter of the nation's election clerks because we have so many local election clerks, whereas most states just have county election clerks. Yeah. Is that a virtue or is it a challenge?
So one of the interesting things it's so interesting once you actually have an index, you can start to talk about these. No one's ever been able to talk about these questions without a baseline. But now that we have a baseline, one of the things we've discovered is, so New England states, which are pretty wealthy, so they ought to have better run systems, a lot of them are pretty low on the ranking, and some suspicion goes to that being decentralization. But, Wisconsin and Minnesota are the exceptions, and that may be because they've overcome the sort of the dilemmas of regulation and decentralization, because there's lots of ways in which it's helpful to have some things done at the state level rather than the local level. Or it may be that we just don't actually know the answer to that question yet.
Other questions? I'm going to move around here real quickly. We'll go here, and then we'll come up to the back of the room.
I know it's a panacea, but term limits would stop a lot of this. If we had a president who was elected once for 6 years, if we had a Congress that was elected with term limits, 4 years perhaps, and then maybe one more other. Do you see anything like that ever happening?
So, I'm not ready to jump on the term limit bandwagon. So I absolutely take the point, which is the idea that if you give people a shorter time horizon, then the hope is that they'll do a better job, and you'll create more competition in the elections. But what we've seen at the state level are a couple of disturbing trends. So one is that you find that people are just thinking more about their political future, not less. So that they're either thinking they're going to go become lobbyists, or they're going to find some other, it's musical chairs, they'll find some other position to run for. Two, it's sort of undermining the professionalization of legislatures. So that they're becoming much more dependent on their staffers, who are the only ones who know anything, because these people are sort of moving in and out so quickly. So it's a hard question, because it has this intuitive feel that it ought to be able to fix the problem, but I should let the political scientists speak. The empirics aren't particularly cheerful, at least at the state level.
We've certainly seen some states that have adopted really serious term limits, and there's some consequences, but it's hard to say that those states have suddenly had a flourishing of democracy. So I think with my political science hat on, I think institutions and the change in institutions like this have marginal effects that may be worth pursuing. But unfortunately, humans are really adaptive to whatever institution they find themselves in. So whether it's, okay, now I'm going to do the state assembly for 6 years, and then I'll do the Senate for 4 years, and then I'll try for governor for a time. Humans are not just sitting there and saying, okay, so it's 4 years, and then I go home to the farm. It makes it extremely difficult. And I think that applies to the earlier things we were talking about policy as well, that institutional changes may be something close to a necessary condition. Having elections rather than not having an election is a big deal, right? But then these tweaks on the margins or the borders of the institutions probably don't, in general, deliver miraculous improvements, even if they do make things slightly better.
We do have a tradition in Wisconsin of electing people for a very long period of time. I think Herb Kohl was like the 5th senator to hold his seat in 100 years. Something like that. I mean, it's pretty amazing, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing.
I'm going to go to the back of the room. Let me go way in the back there first, and then we'll come up to you next.
Hi, Nick Kovac, City of Milwaukee Alderman, 2 years into my second term, for the record.
Do you want to answer that question?
He's one of my constituents. He knows. Very true. But I wanted to go back to what you brought up, Professor Gerken, about the Citizens United decision, which you alluded to, and it was news to me that there's a new decision potentially in the pipe. And your attitude, or you might be right, I think, in saying that we just need to change the Supreme Court. I fear that you're correct, that we're going to have to wait that long, if ever, because depending on who's president next, the timing of deaths or retirements, it may not even work out. But in the interim, a lot of people, I'm not sure it's totally mainstream yet, but among the progressive community, it's sort of priority number one. And there's the Move to Amend movement, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So for me, I'm sponsoring legislation to put that on the ballot next year, just because I think it's a good idea to have more of a conversation about whether one CEO in Janesville should be able to give Governor Walker $500,000, which may explain the June-November 12 split. I mean, the disparity in spending was really phenomenal if you factor in the third-party money. Obviously, it wasn't to him. It was, well, actually, it was to him because of the recall. But anyway, I digress. My question is, does it make sense from a constitutional law perspective to even talk about amending the Constitution to trump the Supreme Court on this?
Yeah, so I'm just going to drive you crazy right now. I think I'm perfectly happy to have a movement to amend the Constitution in the hope that it will generate a discussion about what the right to vote is and so on. But I think it is so hard to amend the Constitution, incredibly difficult to actually get it done. And then even once you do it, it's so easy for a court to erode it, death by a thousand cuts over time, that I would rather see the effort put into politicking this rather than amending the Constitution. Now, these can be the same thing, right? You can drive a political movement through an amendment process. So the ERA is a perfect example. One of my colleagues writes a great piece that says, the ERA looks like it failed because, of course, there's no equal rights amendment in the Constitution, but in fact, the social movement that put that in place changed everything, including the opinions of the justices. And they eventually, over time, gave the women's movement most of what they would have gotten out of the RA, even though there was never any formal textual amendment. So I would much rather see a movement put behind something that I think is more likely to succeed, unless we just sort of understand it to be a conversation driver, because I think it's just so incredibly hard to do. We amend the Constitution much more easily by changing the minds of the American people, by changing the minds of the Supreme Court justices, really, than we do by putting something new into the text.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. This is very informative. I've spent 30 years in local politics, and I can tell you snow plowing and filling potholes is an important element in a local election. But having said that to you, I can tell you that I wonder if you are sensing what many of us at the some of us at the local level, especially the last 10 years, have been sensing. They come into the mayor's office, they'd say to me, Ted, I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. Democrats tax and spend, Republicans borrow and spend. I've had it. And I sense in these communities a growing cynicism between the two parties. Is there any, in your view, in your analysis, any possibility for additional, like a third party coming?
Oh, so what makes third parties so hard to get moving is that the one thing, maybe the only thing nowadays, that Republicans and Democrats can agree on is they don't want third parties. So there are systematic and deep handicaps all throughout the system to prevent third parties, even setting aside just the political science insight, which is, if you just imagine us as a row of voters, and you think, well, it'd be nice to have someone representing here and someone over here so that we have a full range of choices. But of course, if you're running against one other person in a winner-take-all system, we're going to be right here and far from the liberals and the conservatives. And so I'll just say, third-party movements, most people think that third-party movements are like bees, that all the power comes in the sting and then they die as the other parties absorb their ideas. So that, if you look at sort of the history of successful third-party candidates, they don't usually win. But what they do is they change one of the parties, move one of the parties toward the left or the right or towards a new policy. And I think that's more realistic given the current legal landscape. I mean, I can't even describe to you how hard it is in almost every state in the country just to run one third-party candidate, the amount of money and legal resources that's required, because the incumbents, sharing this view, have put in place one legal obstacle after another for third parties. So those will have to go if you really want a robust chance at it.
Take one more quick question. Yes.
Thank you. Question, I guess, is for the entire panel. Concerns have been raised about the money, about the electoral college versus popular vote, etc. Everybody drinking the Kool-Aid, the red getting redder, the blue getting bluer, etc. There may be an answer that solves all of those things, and I'd like to know, would you support the truth in advertising rules that business and everyone else has to be applied to elections as well? It seems to me if we had truth in elections and truth in advertising of what the politicians say, we could solve a lot of those problems. It would also eliminate the term limits because the people, ultimately, these people work for us, and if we don't do our job, we need the term limits. If we do our job, we don't need term limits because we'll vote them out after one term. Would you support the truth in advertising? And that's across the board here on the panel.
I think you should take this one.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I love it.
answer whether it's going to work before you have the...
Absolutely. The issue is who decides what's truth. I mean, that is the hardest thing. So, there's been the explosion of political fact-checking at newspapers and other news media, and the fact-checking itself becomes so contested. So I'm sorry to say I'm kind of dubious about what role that could have as a practical matter because of what's the authoritative decision about truth and falsity when it comes to these. So if anything, it says those voters that have to decide whether to reelect this guy or throw them out are thrown back on their own resources in the, competing claims that are made. And that's a tough situation, but at least as a purely practical matter, I don't know how we get past that unless you choose to go read the PolitiFact column every day and believe what you see there. And that in itself, as I say, is so highly contested that it's hard for me to think that we get very far with it.
Yeah, I mean, so much political communication sort of falls between literal truth and literal falsehood. It's all by inference, for example, where you could have a campaign ad that is not factually untrue, but it's inviting a false inference, but it doesn't actually say so explicitly. And I know that the courts have wrestled with this. I covered the McCain-Feingold debate in Congress and before the courts, and a lot of these things sort of fail on those standards of bright line tests, and you have to, if you invite confusion in terms of the interpretation, that's sort of a crippling thing constitutionally. So I don't know how I guess I'm with Charles, I don't know how you achieve that.
It's so interesting they just gave you the law professor answer. I mean, so I will say, just to agree with them, I'm sort of a formalist on the First Amendment, and one of the main impulses behind the First Amendment is a worry about letting those in power regulate the speech of those who are challenging them. And so the worry is that it's going to be very hard to do that in a way that doesn't end up intruding on speech. So it's not perfect, and I suppose if I could pick one completely reasonable person to make all of those decisions that everyone would trust, I suppose you could imagine it. But inevitably, I think the reasons why we have that worry about those in power regulating those challenging them goes to the sort of deep core of our constitutional values. And so I accept those, and I would worry quite a bit under the First Amendment.
One quick follow-up, if I can. Just a suggestion. Given that Charles has run some extremely accurate polls lately, would you consider just having him polled and do away with the elections?
I'll accept contributions anytime.
We're going to wrap things up there. Our next event is October 16th. Tina Rosenberg, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and writes a pretty interesting blog on the New York Times called Fixes, will be here with us. And tonight, again, Heather will be presenting her lecture as part of our Bowdoin lecture, and we're all looking forward to that. That'll be at 4:30. I'm afraid it's all sold out already, so if you don't have registration in advance on that one, I think you're out of luck tonight. But anyhow, I want to thank Heather, and I want to thank Charles and Craig for being with us today. And again, thanks to you for your interest and your attendance today. Thanks very much.